Disclose, disclose, disclose. Why am I saying this at the top of a rental property budgeting video? Well, the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm about to go through the agenda of what we're going to discuss today, and I don't want you to have any surprises. I want you to hang out for this video because you're getting value out of it, not because you've been tricked into something. So I'm going to talk about that. But as a note, the reason why I talk about disclosure also is because you will find, if you are a new landlord or new to renting out a property, that tenants can handle a lot. They are flexible in the types of situations that they will rent in, but what they do not like is to be surprised. And that is often where you see a relationship sour, is when they come in and there's some kind of surprise, however minor. So that's why I always tell my consulting clients that are aspiring landlords and new to landlording to disclose everything so that your relationship is set up on the right track and it makes it a good experience for you as a landlord and also a good experience for the tenant. Now let's talk about what this video is going to cover today. So in this video, I'm going to do a quick market overview, and I'm just going to talk about the market patterns that are happening in early 2025. If you're watching this 3 years from now, skip forward and or watch it and see if I was right. Who knows? So I'm going to cover that first, and then I'm going to talk about budgeting. And budgeting breaks down to 4 simple items: costs, variable costs, emergency fund, and rents. So I'll talk about all of those. And then finally, I'm going to dabble in one of my favorite things, which is unsolicited advice. Before we get going, I'm Erin Spradlin. This is my channel. It is built for landlords that have 5 or fewer properties and or are new to the landlording space and want to learn how to rental property manage on their own. So if that interests you, or you want more content on vetting, platforms, etc., it is worth subscribing. If you have learned something, or if you learned something during this video, a like is appreciated. And if you are looking for additional help, I offer consulting packages for 1 hour, 2 hour, and a hold my hand mentor package. And this is for people that just want to run their own rentals but don't know how to get started with the first one. Okay, so let's talk about what is going on with the current market dynamics, because there's some very interesting things happening in the US single family home rental market, and that's where the focus of this video is going to be today. As a side note too, everything that I talk about in the budgeting will be relevant for any kind of rental model that you're doing, whether that's short term, mid-term, which is 30 plus days furnished, or long-term unfurnished. I'm going to talk about what's happening, then I'm going to talk about how it's relevant to you in the short term, how I think you can prepare, or what you can expect for in the long term. Okay, so here's the information that you want to have as a landlord or a rental property owner in early 2025. So we saw the highest number of housing starts in April of 2022. Housing starts means that residential home building began. So that was the highest it had been in quite some time in April 2022. So it peaked at that point. We have the highest vacancy rate that we have seen in 26 quarters, so 6.5 years. And that vacancy rate is at 6%. And that's for single family homes. Year over year, we've seen rental growth stall out for single family homes, and that's less than 1%. 85% of homeowners currently have a mortgage that is below 6%. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what's happening politically with the administration. I am not getting political, but you just need to understand what they're doing and how that might also impact the housing market going forward. So right now, the current administration has put a tariff on imported lumber from other countries. So that will affect the cost to build housing, and that will affect future housing starts. And second, the current administration is aggressively deporting people, and a lot of the people that are being deported have helped us build housing. So that also is going to affect housing long term. Okay, so now let's talk about the short term. Basically, in the short term, it's more of a renter's market than it is a landlord's market, and that's because those housing starts that were high in April 2022 are coming to completion or completed in 2024. So there's more housing on the market, and so you're seeing the rent soften. That's why we've only seen less than 1% growth year over year, and then the vacancy rate is higher, and that's because there's more housing. So with this means for you as a landlord is that you need to be flexible with your rent prices. And if you are not getting any traction, likely the first and most important move you can do is drop your prices until you start to see tenants come in. And I know this might be frustrating, and I will talk about that at the end in the unsolicited advice part of this video. Okay, so drop your prices until you get tenants in, because the tenants and the renters have a little bit more power pricing wise right now than landlords and homeowners do. Second thing to pay attention to is long term. What are the rent prices going to look like? Well, we think late 2024, early 2025 that the rent prices and the housing prices might go back up, because we're not going to see a lot of housing starts for a long time because of that tariff issue and because of the deportation issue. Also, there's not a lot of movement because all of these homeowners have interest rates that are really low, so they're not very inclined to go anywhere. So the housing situation, although it is better for renters right now and it has improved, which is a good thing, we don't know that that's going to continue. And if it doesn't continue, then probably there's going to be a lack of supply and inventory for housing and for rents again. And if that happens, then we can expect the cost for rent and the cost for houses to go back up. Okay, so now let's get into the budgeting portion of this video. We're going to start with fixed costs. Fixed costs are exactly what they sound like, which means they are the same cost every month. And the bulk of your fixed costs are going to be your mortgage, but it will also be like HOA fees, Wi-Fi, etc. But the reason why the bulk of it will be your mortgage is because your mortgage is going to include principal on your loan, interest on your loan, taxes, and insurance. And because your taxes and insurance are rolled into your loan, I'm not going to put separate line items for them, because I want this budget to be simple, I want it to be easy, and I want it to be practical. And from a practicality perspective, you're only having one payment pulled from your bank, and that's the mortgage payment. So you don't really need a separate line item for your tax or for your insurance, because it's rolled into your mortgage. I'm also going to talk about PMI briefly here. PMI stands for Property Mortgage Insurance. And if you have purchased a property as a straight investment, you probably put 20% down. And if you put 20% down, then the bank or your loan institution doesn't require you to have PMI. That property mortgage insurance is basically to protect whoever lent you the money to acquire the property. So if you default, they're still protected. But if you put 20% down, then it's not required. However, if you put less than 20% down, it is required. Now, alternately, if you only put 5% down and you live there for a while, now you're moving on and you've paid and paid and paid. If you've paid up to 20% of the loan, or the property has really appreciated, then you may also be able to run an appraisal and get that PMI off. But the reason why I'm talking about PMI is because if you are required to have PMI, that will also be part of the loan. Okay, so underneath that, HOA fees. HOA fees are going to be a fixed cost every month. You can include that as a line item. Wi-Fi is typically a fixed cost as well, so we put it there. You may be wondering where the cap rate is. I'm going to talk about that with the emergency fund, because in my opinion, cap rate is just a fancy way of saying emergency fund. So when we get to the emergency fund portion, we'll talk about cap rate there. But this also could be a fixed cost, and we'll talk about how to approach that. All right, next in your budget is going to be variable costs, and variable costs are anything that's going to change. This is typically utilities, and depending on the type of rental model you have or the type of landlord you are, depends on how much your utilities are going to be. So for a long-term unfurnished, a lot of times the tenants will pay all the utilities. For a midterm, often the landlord pays for the utilities. For a short term, the landlord will pay for the utilities as well. So utilities like water, AC, etc. They're variable costs, and that's because different tenants might use more or less. The same tenant might use more or less depending on the month. Same thing with AC or the heat. You're going to see ups and downs depending on what's happening with the climate outside, right? So the utilities fall under variable costs. You may also put yard work or cleaning under a variable cost, because you might just have yard work in the summer, or you might just have snow removal in the winter, and cleaning cleaning might not be one of those things that happens every month, but just when you're doing tenant turnovers. You might add a line item for those types of issues where you know they happen quarterly, and depending on the work being done, there might be a shift in how much you pay with that. All right, next section is going to be emergency costs. So 5% is a conservative amount, and you can tie this 5% to either what your mortgage is or how much your rent is. Now, if you tie it to the mortgage, then the 5% is going to be the same every month. If you tie it to what your rents are, then that's going to change depending on how much in rent the tenant is paying you. And I think being thoughtful about your emergency costs is smart because it's not necessarily a one size fits all. What I mean by this is if you're in a new build, you're probably not going to have a lot of emergency costs because the property is new, the appliances are new, so you don't have a lot of reasons to think an impending disaster is in the immediate future. Same thing if you're in an HOA. If you're in an HOA, then you're basically just responsible for the unit, but the exterior, the roof, the maintenance of the yard work, that's being covered in your HOA costs. So if you're in a new build or you're in an HOA, you can be conservative with your emergency fund, and because a lot of that has already been taken care of for you. If you are in a really old home or you have a really old water heater or furnace, or you know the appliances haven't been switched out in a long time, then you might actually want to bring that emergency fund / CapX up. But when you hear people talk about CapX, etc., they are talking about an emergency fund. It's basically ways to make yourself whole if things go sideways. Okay, and then the final section of this budget is talking about rents and how to find rents. It is much easier to find rents in the long-term unfurnished space than it is for the midterm or the short term. Often with my consulting clients, I see them go sideways pulling rents for the midterm and for the short term, and I'll explain why that is. It's easier to pull rents on a long-term rental is because the aggregators, so let's say Zillow or Rentometer, and those are two resources that you can use to pull long-term unfurnished rents, and you can pull those rents totally free to you as the landlord, right? But the reason why you can get really good data on long-term rent rates, long-term unfurnished rent rates, Zillow and Rentometer are just pulling from properties in the same neighborhood, in the same school district, likely a very similar bedroom bath configuration, right? So that's good data because it's very similar to what you're trying to rent. It's much harder for landlords to get the right numbers for rents in the midterm or short-term space because there's furniture involved and there's utilities involved, and you might have different platform costs like Airbnb versus Furnish Finder. Also, your design and your aesthetic makes a difference. So it's harder to find comps for those properties and to pick the right rent rates on it. So but if you have a long-term unfurnished rental, then it's real easy to fill out. And those other types of properties, midterm and short-term, you're either going to have to get more help with that or you're going to have to experiment with it a little bit before you figure out exactly what your rent rate is. And then to figure out how your budgeting is going to go, you're going to take your rents and you're going to subtract from your rents your total expenses, so your fixed costs, your variable cost, and then your emergency fund. And whatever is left over is what you have made for the property for that month. Now, if you want to annualize all of this, you can just take those numbers and then times them by 12, and then you have an idea of how your year is going to look, or at least some rough numbers. Now let's get into the unsolicited advice portion of this video. So the reason why I want to talk about this is because it comes down to rents. People get very dogmatic about what they want the rent to be, and this dogma works against the landlord. It hurts the landlord. So if you have a mortgage that's $2,000, but you're only getting interest at $1,900 a month, people get really upset about this and they refuse to rent out for less than the mortgage. And I totally get that. It's really frustrating. Nobody wants to rent out for less than the mortgage. But I want to throw a few things out for you, make you question some of the information or the education that we've all gotten in real estate that may or may not make sense. So the first is that Airbnb and the furnished rental sites really didn't gain popularity or traction until, let's say, 2012, 2014, which means that all the people that made money in real estate in the United States did it without probably heavy duty cash flow, or at least not a lot of cash flow from the time that they bought up until like 5 or 10 years out. And the reason for that is because probably if you bought like in 1980, your mortgage was probably not that much different than the rent. But if you held on to that property from 1980 through 2010, then your fixed mortgage stayed the same. The number that you paid out of pocket stayed the same while the rents climbed. And so that's where you started to see more money come in. But it took time for people to get that money. So it was much more of a buy and hold pattern. And I think a lot of us have forgotten that as they've gotten more and more interested in real estate education, and they're hearing about all these furnished rental deals that are making people crazy amounts of money. Well, just keep in mind, there are lots of people that are very rich in the US off of real estate, and they did it without furnished rentals for a long time. They bought and waited, and then they made money, which leads me to my next point, which is that we think about cash flow and appreciation the wrong way. So sometimes people will say appreciation is the icing on the cake. No, appreciation is the cake. Cash flow is the icing on the cake. 80% of real estate returns come from appreciation, not from cash flow. So when you think about that, it allows you to have more flexibility with your rent rates. And then finally, let's talk about this situation where you have a property that you have to pay $2,000 a month for a mortgage with, and you're only getting $1,900 in interest. Now, if you're obstinate and you're stubborn and you won't shift on that, then you stand to lose $2,000 for every month that it doesn't rent, because you're looking for that golden renter that will pay $2,000 or more, because that's what your mortgage is. But if you had taken a renter for $1,900 a month, someone is paying you $1,900 and you're paying $100. And you would have to accept $1,900 a month for 20 months straight, almost 2 years straight, before you would equal that 1 month of $2,000 in losses. So just be flexible with your pricing. That's the best advice I can give to people. And be mindful of your vacancy rate, because that's also where I see people lose a lot of money, is that they get this adherence or the stubbornness around what the rent should be, when the market is telling you that the rent should be something else. Okay, if you have come this far, then you are probably interested in real estate content and how to be a new landlord, in which case you're probably also interested in how to find quality tenants and how to avoid tenants that have problematic behavior. And if that sounds like you, then I recommend checking out this video here.